Hi, my name is Neal Iund. My company is NIT Inc. out of Centerville, Utah. We have a small provisional website called SewTechnical.com. This website is intended to help do-it-yourselfers as well as dealerships wanting to repair the old Swiss-made Bernina sewing machines. Tonight we're going to start with the Bernina 730, replacing a Camstack. This discussion will help you understand how to determine whether one of these Camstacks is going to work in your machine or not. This will make all the difference in having a machine that sews perfectly with the automatic device. Before we begin, we need to talk a little bit about the aftermarket Camstacks that are available by manufacturers from China or I'm not exactly sure where. Although the Camstacks seem to work in general, there are some real problems with dimensional measure and some faulty machining on these Camstacks. Look at the actual measurement on this gear. If we were to take a caliper, a digital or a dial caliper, and measure from the inside radius of the profile on the cam, we're going to come up with a dimension. The dimension for a Bernina OEM diameter using a typical digital caliper, it's not a real accurate measure, but it's accurate enough, is going to show you that it's going to indicate 37.7 millimeters. If we were to look and measure at some of these other Camstacks, we're going to find that the dimensional measure from here to here is going to range from 37.3 to 37.5 millimeters. This means that when this Camstack is installed, that whole Camstack is going to roll a little bit left and a little bit right. The problem with that is that under normal running conditions, when the stylus is ascending the cam, there's a force in the opposite direction against that stylus, and then when that stylus starts to descend off of that lobe, that whole Camstack is going to jump, and then you're going to get a knock in the machine, and you're also going to get a glitch in the actual form of the automatic pattern. Something to watch for as well is the actual profile right here of this Camstack gear. On a lot of the cams that I've seen, or a lot of the Camstack gears, I found that this profile is shifted to the left, which means that with this, the gear is actually going to favor one side of the worm wheel. That can become an issue where that is very, very tight. I've seen the opposite, where that profile is shifted to the right, and then it can also become very, very tight. That isn't going to work. And one of the reasons it won't work is, of course, obviously, it's going to bind the machine. But sometimes if we have too small a diameter, when it's actually on center, then we actually have too much play, so the Camstack will not work well. It functions, but it won't work well. To make this a little easier, I've already chipped away the gear on the Camstack, but to tell you how this works, I would simply, when you find the crack on this side, simply turn the hand wheel so the Camstack rolls to the opposite side where the crack is going to be, and it will always be where one of these holes lines up. Put a screwdriver in there and then just whack it lightly, and it will actually chip that gear apart. You remove both halves, and then the Camstack will be able to spin like this. Now, we're going to go ahead and start to remove parts, and we'll show you how to correctly do that without damaging the frame of the machine or the bearing post right here. So, we can loosen the two screws on the pattern indicator, remove those. Take the pattern indicator down. Now, just to let you know, I usually use lacquer thinner to clean oil and so forth off screws. You do not want to take the pattern indicator and drop it in lacquer thinner. You won't have any paint left on that indicator at all. Now, in order to remove the Camstack, the easiest way to do this, of course, is to take the screw in the Camstack. We want to loosen it. Then we'll go to the spur gear, and we'll loosen this gear here. We'll take the second screw and loosen it. And now we'll slide that gear out just a little ways, take one of the screws and screw it back in. What you do not want to do is to then pry that axle out. By doing that, you can force the camstack over and it will jam in, especially if you left the gear in instead of chipping the gear out. If you left the gear in, it will actually wedge itself, and then you can actually damage the frame by prying too hard. So what I do here is simply jam the camstack like this, and then we can push that camstack axle out, and we can then remove the spur gear. We can move it further out. What we don't want to do is have the camstack slide axially back toward the back of the machine. Once that's done, then we can wiggle this, the axle out. The axle is going to have generally a lot of oil varnish on it, so we'll want to remove that. So once we pull the axle out, we're going to want to clean the axle in a lacquer thinner. We'll also want to take a moistened Q-tip. Here I've made some Q-tips on some steel shafts, and we'll want to go in here and clean all of the oil varnish out of the bore, the large bore, and then all the way through, and clean this bore. Once that's done, then we'll want to go in the machine, and you'll have an oil pad that at this point is going to be worthless because the foam is gone. But what I'm going to do is remove that entire oil pad. It isn't necessary to have in there anyway. So that goes in the trash. Put the screw back in place. The reason I do that is you can have some oil collect in there, especially if the machine gets over lubricated, and have it drip down underneath on the open arm. And we'll clean that out. Okay. Now we're going to change the cam on the camstack. We'll show how that is done using a vise. And also a special tool, which is a Bernina tool. And what it does is it aligns the spokes. So if you have this tool and you don't have a vise, use the tool. You can slide the tool down the spokes like this. In this case, it's a little tight, which tells me that maybe these screws have been loosened a little bit on the camstack itself. So we'll loosen those slightly, and then we'll force this down in. Okay. At this point, we can remove the screws. And we could put a number 4 Max Baumann screwdriver in the old camstack, and we can then simply knock it out of place like this. My favorite thing to do, however, is not to do that at all. Because I have good vices in my shop, I use a vise to simply pinch the camstack tight. I can put this in there if I want, but I can pinch the camstack tight, remove the old camstack, and then put the new one in without ever having to worry about losing my factory settings on the camstack. It's important to note that these cams can be slightly rotated, and it will throw off the lateral movement from, and you'll have a variance from one pattern to the other, to the next. The next thing that we want to discuss is a problem with oil varnishes in these older machines, because it's the biggest single problem that we have with older Bernina machines is oil varnish. And machines that haven't been run for a long time because they had a broken camstack or a broken vertical shaft gear like this one has, these machines can get stiffer and stiffer. What I've done is I've made a special tool with a 5mm screw thread on one side, and I've got a very small, a very fine pitch 5mm on the other side, which is the same screw dimension as what you'll find with the worm wheel. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to use a little bit of lacquer thinner. We'll put it in the hole. we'll take this lever with a screw end on it. We'll screw it into the hole, and that'll allow me then to be able to, with the leverage on this lever, wiggle this gear so that I'm free now of oil varnish. We'll be able to slide it back and forth. I can remove the shaft, this, and I'll want to be able to then roll that gear back and forth without any difficulty. Make sure that I clean all the varnishes off so that it's just like a brand new machine. It will roll beautifully and I'll be able to make the adjustment easily. Make sure that this gear has been slid all the way against the thrust collar. It's important that that gear is against the thrust collar. That gives the worm screw the center line of this shaft. This is a thrust collar is made axially to a specific length to space that out so that the relationship of the worm wheel to the center line of the camstack is right on the money. Now we're going to install the camstack. Screw up, as mentioned, like so. We're going to take the axle. We're going to just lightly moisten the axle here with, and here I'm using Kluber UH168. And all we want to do is just put a very, very small coat of lubricant there. We'll now install the camstack axle all the way through. Now when we push this all the way in, we know that this camstack, the gear itself, is now undersized because this is what we've measured. This is one of these. Now watch how much play we've actually got here on that camstack. That's not really too bad. I'd prefer to have it tighter than that, but that's the way it is. Now that that's done, we're going to set the pattern indicator in place. Just so you'll know, for those of you that are Bernina dealers, you probably have wondered what this little tool was for. This is made just for the 730 machine, and on the late model 730s, that is to say from 1967 on, the camstack pattern indicator had a hole in the gear here, and it also had a hole through the frame. So what we can do is we can roll that gear and then install the tool, aligning the gear with the frame. It gives us a little handle to then set this device in place. We'll go ahead and set the screws on it. When I set this in place, I want to make sure that this indicator mount that the gears are parallel and that they're pushed in so that I'm not real hard, but I don't want to have any play in them either. Set our screws. Remove the indicator tool. Don't worry about this right now. We'll adjust that later. What I've done now is I've selected the middle cam, about the middle. It's actually not quite at the middle. I'll show you the pattern I'm going to use. And so the pattern is coming all the way down to the right side in the needle plate. And then the beginning of the pattern, this is where pattern indication comes in handy, is when the needle then moves to the left side. So you can see here we're coming from the right side. Watch how that needle bar functions. If I turn it backwards, you can see how it's sliding this way. Okay, so we know parabola is off. That is to say the movement, parabolic movement of the needle bar is, instead of moving and changing at the top at the parabola, we are actually sliding sideways this way. We're going to stitch in and then we're going to slide back this way. So we want to time that so that we have the correct parabolic movement. Right here I'm using this particular pattern. We have 36 stitches per pattern, And so we're going to start here, and we're going to move to the right side of the needle plate, then the needle is going to jump over to the left side. This is where pattern indication begins. And so what we want to do is we're going to check then, if we look at the stitch hole, I'm going to draw the stitch hole like this. So that's really what we're looking at. We're going to adjust the machine so that we have the correct parabola. Direction changes like this and then down like this. We don't want to have the needle moving like this and have the parabola over here or have the parabola over here. Okay, we want it center. You can see where the needle is now changing from far right, we're going to far left. What we'll do now is we'll back that needle up to the top here, top dead center. Make sure needle position is on center. Make sure stitch width now is going to be at 0. We're going to put our thumb on the needle bar, the needle bar screw, and then what we'll do is we'll find the highest position of the needle bar. At this point, if I were set properly so that the parabola was top dead center, if I turn the stitch width here, I'm not going to have any movement of the needle. But you can see how my needle is moving to the left. So, what I do is I use the corner of the frame of the machine. You can also put a piece of tape and put a little mark here, maybe a piece of tape and a mark here. But I just use my thumb like this in the corner of the frame, and then as I move this back and forth, I can rotate in the direction of machine rotation, and you can see my movement gets worse. Okay, so if we now go back to the start point here, and now I do this again, and I'll move it the opposite direction. All of a sudden, the needle will then almost stand still. By loosening the set screw on the worm wheel, we can now take the hand wheel and turn that back the same amount of distance from our check and tighten the screw. And we're done. So now let's watch and see what it looks like. So here, let's bring the needle to the top dead center, and now we'll move the needle bar back and forth, and I have barely any movement. Okay, I can get it a little bit better, but I have another problem. Because this gear is undersized. Now watch what happens when I move the needle. See how that needle snaps here? If you look at the camstack, you'll also see the camstack jump. And the reason it jumps is because the diameter of the gear is too small. That's the problem with this. And that's because there's too much play in this gear. The gear itself is defective. It's too small diameter. And it makes a noise. As you can see, it's important to make sure that you have a part that's going to work in the machine. The next thing that we're going to do now is to check to make sure that the parabola adjustment of the automatic device, the Camstack, is synchronized with the zigzag parabola. It is possible between the two mechanisms to have the Camstack out 360 degrees. Even though both parabolas are correct, they're not synchronized together. This is to say that when we look at how this works, we have on this side we have a transmission support that switches a switching pawl from the zigzag fork. When we switch it backwards, it switches into the automatic fork. Now if we put this into neutral position, now you're going to see the needle bar. When we turn the stitch width up, we're going to see the switching pawl in neutral, and then we can see how the zigzag mechanism is constant and always moving. And we can also see if I pull the cam lever back, we're going to see how the automatic fork moves independently. In this case, this cam is actually 360 degrees out, so here's the problem. So when we run the machine, watch the two forks. Now here I've selected a cam that gives me a symmetric pattern back and forth like zigzag, and it'll diminish down to straight stitch. As you can see, it stalls here, then it'll step back up, but you can see how these are moving opposite. The problem is that when we stop sewing, like this, it is possible that these are misaligned so that when we switch this back, the switching pawl won't immediately go in. On some machines, this thing will actually stick and then it won't go in. The next thing you know is that a customer complains and says that something's defective with the machine. So it's important that these are synchronized. So the way we do this is I can take in this case I'm using a tungsten carbide tracing awl here. When you look at the zigzag worm drive here that drives the cam, we have a set color on the left side. What I can do is when I look at the adjusting screw there, I can make a little timing mark here, and then I can make a timing mark adjacent to that on the gear. With the two marks like this, I can loosen then the zigzag gear, and I can rotate it 360 degrees, aligning again the marks, and we're done. Show you how this is done. We'll do this. I've already loosened one screw. Hopefully this will be the screw that we want to make the adjustment on. If I'm lucky, it will be. It isn't, so let's tighten that screw and go to the screw that I want to make the let's see, let's loosen this one. And then we can go back to this, and now watch. And away we go. We'll hold this. And I want to make sure that that gear does not slide away from the set collar. I can loosen here and turn the hand wheel through again, and we can align the marks. Now we're done. Now if we watch this again, we're on cam number, in this case, cam number 13. If we look at this, we're going to be on this cam here. Now we've used number 12 as we've shown in the diagram to find our lateral movement where we want to make that parabola adjustment, so the lateral movement goes from the far left to the far right. But here I want to use a symmetric pattern that gives us basically a zigzag component here, a zigzag pattern. We can check both of those forks. So now watch the forks. Away we go. Now they're moving together. Now this one will stop, and as that zigzag picks up again, you can see they're moving together. The last thing that we're going to do now is we're going to reinstall the pattern indicator. We've done that. We had to remove this to actually show you how the parabola adjustment was done on the worm gear, on the worm wheel. But now we're going to go ahead and time the pattern indicator. Most of the time when people put a Camstack in, they give no thought to the pattern indicator. They just assume that it's going to be in time, and it's not. We'll show you how to do this right now. So here we're using the adjustment tool again, or the setting tool. We're going to place this in place, put our screws in place, like so. We want to make sure that the indicator is adjusted so that the gears, again, are parallel. We want to make sure that we don't have play existing between the two spur gears. We'll go ahead and set the pattern indicator here and here. And I can wiggle the gear, and I don't see that I have any play. And a lot of people think that putting this in, as I mentioned, they're finished. But let me show you why we're not finished. So we can then remove the pattern indicator. See how much play there is in this gear? Now, in order to adjust the gear, we have set one screw at about roughly 2 o'clock here. And this is on the adjustment on the end of the Camstack axle. And what we're going to do is to have our needle set so that the lateral swing comes to the first stitch on the left side, because that's where pattern indication begins, as mentioned previously. And now we can run the machine, and we can mark, if we want to, we can mark where that pattern indicator mark is. Don't move the pattern indicator here, but just mark it with a pencil. And so, in this case, we're just barely to the left side of the frame mark. There's actually 3 marks on the frame here. As we run the machine, you'll be able to see how the cam will make its pattern form, and then it moves to the right, And then as it stitches the last stitch on the right side, now the needle will then swing to the left. The point of the needle should be flush with the needle plate. At that point, we want that pattern indicator to be on the mark. You cannot just move the indicator on the mark, because you can see here that when we run it again, the pattern indicator will swing to the left side and it'll come back. It'll be on the mark, and now it'll swing to the right side. Okay. Now we've made the worm gear, the spur gear adjustment. We can do another 36 stitches. Okay, we're set perfect. This concludes the installation of a worm gear on a Bernina 730 with its associated adjustments. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you next time.